be it. Well, hello, Dr. Holly Powell-Jones. Thank you very much for coming to on our anti-trolling campaign. Dr. Holly Powell-Jones is an educator and you're a lecturer, a researcher in social media law and ethics, and you're also the founder of Online Media Law UK.
Mhm.
So you're gonna talk us through a bit more about the legalities of this wild west that is social media, and particularly about trolling. I feel like it's a phenomenon that has developed also from the excessive freedom sometimes that one can perceive from being on social media, which is sometimes felt as a space without much control and a lot of freedom, but also without responsibility sometimes. So is it that the case, or is it actually not like that?
Yeah, so I've been running workshops on social media law and ethics since 2013. And initially, I just started running them with children and young people because that's where I think a lot of the concern tends to be focused around, with things like cyberbullying and sexting and stuff like that. But actually, I was inspired to do that because of my background in journalism. When I trained as a journalist, I was quite shocked to learn how many media laws there were and how many things you had to be careful about publishing and putting online, because I'd been quite active on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and I hadn't learned all of that stuff. So yeah, I would definitely say I've been running these workshops with the specific purpose of trying to share some of that knowledge and education that you get as a journalist to learn about media law with ordinary social media users, because I think you're absolutely right. The general perception is that there aren't any laws online, and sometimes, you know, that is exacerbated by public figures and people who might refer to it as being a wild west. So sometimes that can make it even worse. People think, oh, there obviously aren't any laws online, but actually there are lots, and if you don't know about them, you can get in quite serious criminal trouble.
Um, can you like make some example, for instance, of some things that have
Mm.
like popped up specifically for your in your own experience, but also as a user and as a journalist as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, you know, the general things that are illegal online that everybody should be aware of are things like threats, sending threats, kind of harassment as well, and stalking. So repeated behavior that causes alarm or distress, and again, controlling or coercive abusive behavior, you know, if it's digitally enabled, can be a criminal offence as well. Things like inciting violence, glorifying and encouraging terrorism, publishing or distributing material that's inciting hatred on the grounds of race or religion or sexuality, things like menacing communications or grossly offensive material, indecent images of under 18s. There's quite a lot of general image-based digital offences as well, you know, sometimes referred to as kind of revenge porn sometimes, and voyeurism and things like that. But then I think the one that it really sticks out, I think, for me, that is the fundamental if you're a journalist, but the public don't know about, is contempt of court. So that is kind of publishing or sharing material that can interfere with the justice process and people's right to a fair trial. And that's the major thing that you get drilled on as a journalist. And the general public often have no idea about contempt of court or anonymity for certain groups of people, or being careful not to prejudice the trial. And that, I think, is very worrying for all of us.
No, definitely. And you mentioned, of course, that it's sometimes difficult for the general public to know about these things. So, how do you find the general awareness of from the public about these types of specific issues, and also how do we go on about making it more accessible to the public?
That's a really good question. So I do find that most of the public might have a common sense idea about things like not sending people threats or harassment and things like that. That tends to be something that people can quite easily recognise. But when it comes to stuff like contempt of court, there's really no awareness at all amongst the public, as far as I can tell. We've had a lot of high-profile criminal cases, for example, over recent years and very recently, where people have actually been quite angry on social media because they say, why aren't they saying that this person did it, for example, when we've got an ongoing police investigation or a trial? Or sometimes you'll have members of the public thinking they're being helpful because they're publishing lots of details or information about a case, perhaps that they've seen or read about on a social media channel. And actually that's all prejudicial material that could get them in serious criminal trouble. The way that I try to explain it to people, because you don't want to sound like you're silencing people when they're trying to help. I often say, look, we all want the same thing. We all want justice for victims of crime. And the thing is, if a trial collapses or there has to be a retrial, or the defence say somebody can't have a fair trial, that's not getting justice for the victim. So I always say, look, these rules, these laws are here for a reason. It's to protect our right to a fair trial, and is actually to protect the process of justice as well. So I think that's one way of explaining it in a way that can help people to understand why it's so important.
I know that you specialize in, of course, English and Welsh law. Do you know if there's a difference with Scots law at all on this subject, or are they fairly similar, or are there any main differences in this?
Yes, so with the full disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer and I can't give out legal advice, there are some slight differences between the law in Scotland and the law in England and Wales. So some slightly different rules around contempt of court, and also defamation, which is not a criminal matter, but it's a civil matter. So that means you can be sued basically for publishing or distributing material that can cause serious harm to reputation. So there's slightly different rules in Scotland around how many people you have to send a communication to before that becomes a risk, compared to England and Wales. And there's also slight differences as well in some of the image-based abuse laws as well, so slightly different pieces of legislation. I actually feel like Scotland's been slightly ahead of England actually on some of those, looking at some of those issues, which is really good. So we've actually had some campaigns in England where we've said, well, actually look at what they're doing in Scotland. They're actually trying to update their laws to protect people in the digital age a bit more. So maybe we could take a leaf out of their book. But broadly, a lot of the rules and a lot of the legislation is kind of UK wide. And you can find out those on the Crown Prosecution Service website. So the CPS has got guidelines to social media offences, which is a good point to just have a look really at all the different laws that apply to social media in one place.
Yeah, that's very useful, especially if someone wants to dig into a bit more into the more legal details. But I was also thinking, is there a difference between what newspapers are able to do and what an individual is able to do in terms of social media and what one can publish? Because it feels like, of course, there's more watchdogs, let's say, or at least perceived watchdogs for news organizations. But at the same time, what's the difference between what an individual can do online and what a newsroom can publish online?
That's a really good point. I think there's a common misconception that there's certain laws that apply to television, radio, print journalists and the media, and then a load of laws that apply to social media. And that's a myth. Really, the reality is we tend to have laws around just behaviours, what kinds of material you can and can't publish or distribute, or communications offences. So actually, generally it's the same laws and the same rules that are applied to citizens within a jurisdiction, regardless of what their job is. So we actually have a duty as citizens to be aware of media law, regardless of whether you're a journalist or not. I do find that when I run training workshops, sometimes social media users and young people especially seem quite outraged that I'm telling them not to do certain things or publish certain things that they feel like the press, the British press, get away with publishing, for example. So often I have to explain that actually there are journalists who do get in trouble all the time for breaking media law. It doesn't mean that we don't have any laws. It does mean that sometimes some publications are perhaps a little bit more loose and free with how they handle those laws compared to others. But it's certainly not an excuse, I would say, to mimic bad behaviour by the press online just because you have a platform. So I think we all have to think a bit like journalists in terms of the ethics and the consequences and the impact of what we publish.
Definitely, it's a bit like sometimes walking on eggshells when you have to deal with certain topics. So it's definitely good to have a bit more knowledge about a bit more awareness about what the rules are for everyone. And trying to think though, in this case, of course, wouldn't there be someone who will maybe get back and say, well, where's my freedom of speech rights? Where are my freedom of speech rights? Why I can't not maybe say something like, what's a thin line between people being able to tell whatever they think and actually having some rules on that.
So it's one of the biggest misconceptions I found from my PhD research actually was misunderstandings about freedom of expression online and what that means as a right and how it works. So often people mistakenly think that freedom of expression is like a blanket right that means that they can say whatever they want to say without any consequences. Now, that's actually not what the legislation says at all. So we have it from the European Convention on Human Rights and also the Human Rights Act, Article 10, but it covers two parts. So freedom of expression is rights and freedoms is part one, but part two is also duties and responsibilities. And there's a list of lawful justifications for limitations on freedom of expression for all sorts of reasons, whether it's national security, justice, and protecting people's reputation or privacy. So there's always got to be a balance, between freedom of expression as a right and not infringing upon other people's rights, for example. So particularly when it comes to things like hate speech online, you do sometimes get people mistakenly thinking, well, that's my opinion, that's my freedom of speech, I can put that out there if I want to. And it's really important that we actually explain to people that that's not the case, that we do have restrictions on that. And that's because it does infringe on other people's rights, essentially, if you don't have that balance, of what's in place. And I think one of the best guides actually on freedom of speech, hate speech and the law is by Index on Censorship, which I can share a link to, but they've got a guide to hate speech, free speech and the law, which very clearly explains how those things are kept in balance. And obviously they are anti-censorship, so they are coming at it from a point of view of wanting to educate people about their freedoms, but also wanting to educate them about their responsibilities that come with that as well.
No, that's very useful. Thank you. You were mentioning also, of course, talking about freedom of expression and hate speech. I'm thinking about the other side of, let's say, censorship, which is more of maybe a censorship that is sort of produced by hate speech. So maybe thinking about journalists that have been maybe abused, or anyone that has been suffering from online abuse as well, especially journalists and female journalists, which is a big issue. But how does that impact on their ability to actually do their job and actually be free to report what they actually want to report, or as some may see, does it come as a package with the job?
Yeah, there's actually some really dangerous potential consequences of allowing trolling and abuse online to just continue unfettered, because what that means is that certain groups of people are disproportionately victimized online compared to others. So we know that, for example, journalists, because of their profession, are more likely to be targeted. We know that women are more likely to be targeted. We know people of color are more likely to be targeted. If you're openly gay or trans online, if you're openly Muslim or Jewish, so these minority groups are disproportionately affected by this. And what that does is it can mean that those people are silenced or excluded from participation in public discourse online. And that can be very scary. There are tons of research actually and reports showing female journalists in particular being really viciously kind of targeted. And it's also about the topics that they cover. So if you cover women's rights as a reporter, or if you cover, for example, the Middle East, or there's certain topics that, or trans rights, those topics can actually make you a target as well. So again, the risk is that we're actually going to infringe on our own rights to access information, to learn about the world, to have a public discourse, and to be informed. Because if those areas of journalism are silenced out, we're not going to hear from those people, and that's going to be very bad for society generally, as well as bad for those individuals.
Definitely, it's always better to have a more diverse discourse and discussion on going on in general. And I'm thinking, what can an individual do to protect themselves to, if they're faced with trolling online, or like if they see someone else being trolled, what can the individual and the social media user in general do?
So I think there's two ways of thinking about safety online. So there's obviously prevention stuff, which is very, very important and very useful. And then there's kind of reaction stuff of what to do, like if you have been targeted. So I would say wherever you can, preparing for and preventing online abuse is obviously preferable. So that can be anything from basic digital security, making sure you've got two-step authentication, password protection, that you're not that you're keeping your privacy under wraps online, that you're getting support from your editor and your newsroom as well, and your boss to you've got a plan for dealing with those issues, etc., policies. That's very, very important for preventing incidents from getting really out of hand in the first place. But also how you react to them matters a lot as well. And I think the kind of the general advice is making sure that you get support as soon as possible, because it can be really, really nasty. A lot of people may think, oh, it's just words, it's just online, it's not important. But a lot of research has shown that it has very serious impacts, on people's health to be trolled online. So I think the priority for individuals is to take care of themselves and their needs. And if that does mean stepping away, then stepping away. I think it's really important, if you've got material that you are thinking might need to be reported to the police, that you keep a record of it wherever possible. So there's an organisation called Glitch UK, which has a template for kind of recording incidents of online abuse and all the evidence that you might need to gather to kind of showcase that somebody has been harassing you, for example. And again, if that's too much for you as a targeted individual to deal with, you can outsource that to, a trusted friend or a colleague or someone who can go onto your social media and gather that for you. There's also quite a lot of support sites out there. So there's a whole range of organisations actually listed on the True Vision website, which is reportit.org. And it's about hate crime, that particular website, but it has a huge list of various organisations who are specialised in helping particular groups of victims as well. So if you have been the victim of, Islamophobic abuse, you may want to speak to Tell Mama as an organisation, for example, because they've got that specialism there. So that's a really good resource I'd recommend as well. And don't be afraid to report material and users to the police as well. If there is that thing where you think this has crossed a criminal threshold, don't be afraid to report it to the police. If you're a victim of crime, you're entitled to that support. And you can obviously use tools within a platform as well to block, to mute, etc., to kind of give yourself a buffer and some space if you need it. But yeah, my main message would be, do not be afraid to reach out and ask for help from support organisations and from the police, because you do deserve it, because this is, often it is criminal levels of kind of abuse online.
So definitely can get very serious. So it's very important to do that. I'm also thinking, what can, in terms of on a newsroom from a newsroom perspective, what can media organizations do to maybe make the environment better for the readers and in general for their users?
There's loads of things that newsrooms can be doing, I think, to make things better, particularly for their journalists. And that can be anything from having an audit of your own policies and procedures in terms of digital security and risk assessment. Risk assessment is something journalists will be used to doing, for example, if they're going to report from a danger zone. But actually, risk assessment should happen in your workplace as well, because this is a health and safety in the workplace issue. I would engage with unions as well, journalists' unions, if you're in the workplace, and specialists on data protection and cybersecurity as well to help with this. Make sure you have policies in place. So every workplace should have a dignity at work and harassment policy for their staff, and it should hopefully cover their freelancers as well. But in that, have you thought about harassment that occurs online as part of your protecting staff policies? And if not, you need to think about it and put that in there, definitely. And so, yeah, audits, policies and training as well. You want regular training for your staff on kind of managing these situations, recognizing what should be escalated, and those sorts of things as well. I'd quite like more journalism degrees and courses and training to cover these issues now as well. That would be really good, so that when people are coming into the workplace, they know to ask about them. But also for your audience as well, if you are on social media, which most news organizations are now, again, having really clear policies for your audience, for your users, so that they're aware of what kinds of behavior will and won't be tolerated, and exactly what will happen if there is, a comment that is complained about or reported to the site. If you're managing that Facebook page or you're managing the comments section of your website, I think the most important thing is just to really clearly communicate with people, what action will be taken if you get a complaint, who by, and possibly, just clear policies. Maybe even making people register with an email address if you want to participate in discussions. That's something a lot of places are doing now. And if you have a particularly contentious topic or story where you have got, for example, contempt of court comments, spreading like wildfire and it's becoming a real risk, sometimes turning the comments off can be a good thing to do, just to make sure that you are protecting yourself, but also protecting users who might inadvertently be breaking the law there as well. But communication is key, and transparency, I think, with everyone, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm also thinking, like, where is, of course, talking about the duties of the newsroom, where duties? Well, yeah, the recommendation, what the newsroom can do, but what instead can platforms do? Are they doing enough to sort of mitigate and trying to stop these phenomenon and online abusive messages, or are they just not doing enough yet?
I think most people would say no, the platforms are not doing enough and they could be doing a lot more. I think that's very, very clear, and a lot of people are in agreement about that. There are some good initiatives that are going on, but of course, I think they could always do more. I think what we do need to be careful of, though, is essentially outsourcing, essentially policing to a tech company, for example, because you have to remember that the design and the structure and the architecture of tech companies and their platforms is to make money. They are there to kind of amp up the attention economy, so that it generates profit for them when they have a lot of interaction, and a lot of kind of heat and debate on their platforms, and a lot of outrage. So there is an element through which, you know, just the very design of those platforms, it's not in their financial interests to kind of necessarily tackle that, although I know some of them are trying to do better. But I think we have to be careful not to, you know, forget individual citizens' responsibilities with regard to their speech and the law, and not to forget the police responsibilities as well. I don't want a future whereby you can no longer report harassment to the police. It has to be dealt with by a big tech company, because we want to make sure that we are, you know, enforcing criminal law through our own justice systems, and not a multinational kind of corporation. So that's just something to be wary of. I actually think most tech companies tend to only respond to their legal requirements within different countries. So actually, you know, we've seen parts of the world, Germany, Australia, etc., trying to actually use legislation to get those companies to take more responsibility. So I think there's public pressure, there's government pressure on tech companies, but ultimately, I think we have to just bear in mind that they are operating on a model of profit that doesn't necessarily put user safety at the forefront of everything they do.
Sure. And you mentioned, of course, that it's important to keep the police involved in this. I'm just wondering, is it a type of issue that gets easily dismissed? Not saying necessarily by the police themselves, but is it something that people dismiss as something not as important as it actually can get?
Yeah, definitely. I've really noticed that that was one of the findings that came out of my research, actually. So when I was talking to young people about different kinds of behaviour online, including some quite nasty abuse, sometimes young people would say, you know, oh, it's just words, though, isn't it? It's just words. It's not doing anything. And I find that really, really interesting, because actually sending a message to someone or publishing a statement or an image is an act. You know, it is doing something, but it might not be seen that way. So yeah, we do have a bit of a problem, I think, where you know, users themselves or you know, people who see this kind of material, and to be honest, sometimes even the police might say, look, that's just something that's happening online, and therefore it might not be taken as seriously as kind of offline offences. You know, it might not always be seen as real crime. And sometimes there have been situations where the police are perhaps not as informed about digital media law either as they could be. So they might mistakenly say to a victim, oh, that's not really broken the law, when perhaps it has. So that can be really tricky as well. I do think more police training and resources is good. I'm sure the police would agree as well that they want more resources and training to deal with crime in the digital age. We've all got to kind of move forward into this new space, you know, and we're all having to upskill journalists, you know, and I think the police are no different to dealing with issues that are happening there. So yeah, education and training, I think, for police as well as the public is quite important.
Oh, sure. And you were mentioning, of course, how the phenomenon like goes through the younger generations as well, because it's also your specialism. So I was thinking, in terms of younger readers that deal with publications online. I know there's quite a lot of new publications now that almost have quite almost a uniquely social media presence. There's quite a lot of them as well, but I'm trying to think, how can media organization deal with maybe the younger generations in terms of protecting them and creating a safer environment specifically for them?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of intergenerational collaboration, actually, particularly in the sort of the digital newsroom, because I think there are a lot of older, more established journalists who could really benefit from actually engaging with and learning from young people about new platforms, new technologies, new ways of storytelling, new ways of finding out about trends and information gathering, etc. And I think for those younger people, what they need from older generations is guidance on things like contempt of court, defamation, privacy law, how copyright works online. That one's an absolute nightmare, by the way. Copyright is something that young people, I mean, it rarely even enters their head that content might be something that you have to pay for, or can't use without permission. So I think on that side of things, there's a lot that that newsrooms could offer in terms of, and it does not even people who want to be journalists, just digital skills and media skills generally. You need to know these things, even if you want to go and work in digital marketing or running your own YouTube channel or whatever. So I think there's a lot of positive opportunities in the digital age for us to have that crossover between different generations and knowledge sharing in this area.
Definitely more communication. And yeah, as you mentioned, like I remember going on to a course, my first journalism course, and into like, oh, you cannot really post everything on your blog. Oh, and you started
Yeah.
thinking, oh gosh, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that, even if you, again, because everything is on social media now, especially for a younger generation. So
Yeah,
and
definitely. It's like a new, it's new social norms, really, I think, for the younger generation that have been shaped by some of these technological kind of affordances, basically. So the fact that you can just record a little voice note or a video and send it to someone instantly is changing how we communicate. And obviously, we've had the pandemic recently, of course, which has changed how all of us are interacting socially, and that's also really refocused people's minds on the importance of digital social interaction and how we can do that in a way that sort of is positive for everyone and inclusive of everyone. So I think that in a way that's moved that conversation forward and put it really at the front and center of some of these debates now.
no, definitely. And I'm thinking that because everything is moving so fast, it must be quite difficult for anyone that is involved with legislation to actually keep up with all of this. And maybe is that a moment to find a way of making laws in a more sort of dynamic way, if that makes sense? Because everything is moving much quicker than it used to.
It's a real challenge for lawmakers, definitely, to try and keep up with changing technology and changing social norms as well. And I know that there have been some legal reviews of digital laws in Scotland. We are having them in England and Wales as well at the moment. So I've been personally to consult with the Law Commission, who are reviewing the law at the moment around online abuse, but also image-based offending and also hate crime and hate speech. So there's definitely efforts to try and update the law for the digital age, but it's also very complicated because of all the things you've already said about balancing with freedom of expression, making sure we don't want to make sure that we're over criminalizing behaviors, or under criminalizing them. So getting that balance right between protecting victims, but then not over criminalizing so that everything is risky, is really, really tough. And it does take a lot of consultation and a lot of time to go through. But the thing is, you want to get these laws right, don't you? And I know that the Law Commission is working quite hard to what they call future future-proof these laws so that they don't need to be updated every 5 minutes, that they can be, set for a longer time. So, for example, one of the ways they might do that is with digital sexual offending, they might put it under under a Sexual Offences Act system rather than a communications or a digital offence, so that it's sort of enshrined in principle, but will apply regardless of the platform or the technology being used. So we're looking at the behaviour and not the text. So, but it's a real challenge. And actually, it's one of the reasons I really love doing social media law workshops with young people. It's because quite often I go in and I'll tell them about some of the laws that apply online, and they'll be outraged. They'll be like, oh, I don't agree with that, or that shouldn't be the case. So I try to say to them, like, that's really good. If you're having a strong reaction, that means you're engaged in the topic and you care about it. And I was like, we actually do need, a whole generation of legal scholars who are interested in digital media, freedom of expression, to come forward to work on these issues. So if you are interested in law and digital media, now is a really good time to get into it, that's for sure.
Exciting times if you want to study, then definitely you won't get bored.
No.